Welcome, and thank you for joining us. Today, we drift into a story buried beneath the ice of history, a moment when the most unstoppable city in America came face to face with a force stronger than steel, louder than traffic, and colder than anything its people had ever known. New York, the city that never sleeps, suddenly found itself silent. No engines, no footsteps, no sirens, just snow, wind, and a frozen world where time seemed to stand still. For 3 relentless days, winter did not just visit New York. It consumed it. This is not just a tale of weather, it is a story of survival, courage, humanity, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people. So sit back, tune in, and travel with us into those frozen streets. When skyscrapers vanished behind storms of white, when the rivers turned to ice, and when New York fought to stay alive, this is what it was like when New York froze for 3 days straight. It began like any ordinary winter in New York, the kind of cold that stings your cheeks, fogs your breath, and paints the city in a thin layer of frost. People woke up to familiar sights: rooftops dusted white, chimneys breathing steam into the air, taxis crawling over slick streets, and bundled crowds pushing through the wind. Winter in New York was nothing new. The city knew how to survive it. It had endured blizzards before. It had handled snowstorms, frozen rivers, and icy nights. But this time, something was different, something quieter, deeper, more menacing. It did not roar like a storm or crash like thunder. It crept, it seeped, it settled over the city like a silent warning. The temperature didn't just fall, it plummeted. Hour by hour, the air grew colder, sharper, biting through coats as though fabric meant nothing. Weather forecasters spoke cautiously on television screens, unsure if their predictions were exaggerated or not extreme enough. People bundled up as usual, complained about the wind like they always did, and kept moving. New Yorkers always kept moving, but the cold had other plans. By midnight, the first signs appeared. The Hudson River, normally rippling under the moonlight, began forming thin silver plates of ice across the surface. Ferry captains radioed warnings of frozen spray coating their windows. Street vendors closed early, struggling as their carts iced over, and their propane tanks hissed weakly. The wind howled along Fifth Avenue, lifting snow and sandblasting it against windows. The cold was no longer a guest. It was a ruler, and New York was its kingdom. Most people didn't notice at first. Inside warm apartments, the city looked calm, almost peaceful. Snow drifted like feathers, resting on fire escapes and taxi roofs. But outside, the ground stiffened, roads grew harder, the air sharpened into something metallic, something painful. By sunrise, the temperature reached a level the city hadn't seen in decades. Weather stations recorded readings that made even the experts stare in disbelief. Sub-zero wind chills, ice forming on exposed skin in seconds, a chill deep enough to break steel and crack stone. But still, New Yorkers tried to live their routines. They layered sweaters, wrapped scarves twice around their faces, pulled gloves over gloves. They stepped out of buildings and felt the shock of cold hit them like a wall. Breath turned instantly to smoke. Eyelashes gathered frost. Car doors refused to open, frozen shut by invisible chains of ice. Yet some pushed on, because New York was a place where quitting felt like weakness. If taxis didn't stop, people walked. If trains were delayed, they waited. If the cold burned their skin, they ignored it. The city had taught them to be tough, but this storm was colder than toughness. The first full day of freezing arrived like a switch flipped. The sun rose, but its light was weak, pale, unable to warm anything it touched. Snow fell, not gently, but thick and heavy, like wet flour dumped from the sky. It blanketed the streets, smothered curbs, buried bicycles, and mailboxes. Plows struggled to push through the wind. Snow replaced itself faster than machines could clear it. The city that ran on speed and rhythm Traffic lights, engines, footsteps began to slow, horns quieted, engines stalled. People walked with their heads down, fighting the icy breath of winter cutting across Manhattan. Inside apartments, heaters rattled and strained, radiators wheezed like tired animals. Some worked, some didn't. In older buildings, heat faded completely. Frost formed on the inside of windows. Curtains stiffened. People saw their breath inside their own living rooms. They rubbed their hands together and wrapped themselves in blankets, realizing that winter wasn't outside the door. It was inside the walls. Pipes began to freeze. Water turned solid inside the narrow metal veins that fed the city. When pressure built, pipes snapped like bones breaking. In bathrooms, ice spread across tile floors. Sinks cracked from the cold. The sound of bursting pipes echoed through apartment buildings, one sharp pop after another. In kitchens, faucets froze shut. People filled pots with snow, hoping to melt it for water, but the temperature was too low even for that. Snow didn't melt. It stayed solid, mocking the hands that tried to save it. People stepped outside for supplies, but the streets were nearly empty. Grocery store doors were frozen shut. Delivery trucks couldn't drive on ice. Slicked highways, shelves inside shops became bare. Bread, milk, canned goods, gone. Those who had stocked up were lucky. Those who didn't were left to ration whatever they had, and the cold kept falling. The sky stayed gray for hours, then darkened early. Night fell fast, too fast, stealing the little warmth daylight offered. The city lights glowed against the snow, but even neon seemed dimmer, weaker, swallowed by the storm. Times Square screens flickered and froze. Restaurants closed early, their windows fogged with frost. Waiters swept snow out of their entryways only to watch it blow right back in. The wind was not a visitor, it owned the night. Stray animals disappeared from the streets. Pigeons huddled under subway grates for warmth. Dogs refused to walk, pulling back against leashes, begging to return indoors. Cats curled near heaters that barely worked. Every living thing felt the weight of winter pressing down like a heavy hand. Taxis crawled along icy roads, skidding, spinning, sliding through silent intersections. Some drivers gave up, turning off their engines to save fuel and curling into their seats for warmth. Others left their cars and walked home, abandoning yellow cabs frozen like monuments in the snow. Subways, the veins of the city, faltered. Tracks froze. Switches locked in place beneath layers of ice. Train doors jammed, metal shrinking under the cold. Commuters waited in underground stations packed shoulder to shoulder, breathing steam into the air, trying to keep warm. Some slept on benches, some huddled near vending machines, some prayed that the trains would move again. But the system, like the city above it, was shutting down, one frozen inch at a time, and the wind kept rising. It roared between skyscrapers, turning avenues into wind tunnels. Snow didn't fall gently. It attacked, flying sideways, stinging skin like shards of glass. People leaned into the wind, but it shoved them back. Traffic lights swung wildly on their wires, creaking, cracking, bending until some snapped loose and crashed into the street. Store signs trembled and tore free, tumbling across sidewalks like broken sails. Yet the cold didn't roar, it whispered. It seeped silently into every crack, every doorway, every open glove. It turned sidewalks into glass. It glittered like diamonds beneath street lamps, and though it was beautiful, it was deadly. Hospitals began filling with the frozen and frostbitten. Ambulances moved slowly, sirens muffled by snow. Stretchers rolled through icy emergency entrances, wheels squeaking against frozen ground. Doctors wrapped patients in heated blankets and rubbed life back into pale skin. Children wept from the pain of thawing fingers. Elderly men and women coughed from lungs tightened by bitter air. The city had faced disease, disaster, and darkness before, but this silent freeze, was different. It was invisible and everywhere. The city government declared an emergency, shelters opened, schools closed, employers called off work. News anchors warned people to stay indoors, but not everyone could. Homeless men and women searched for warmth wherever they could find it. Train stations, building lobbies, stairwells, laundromats, any place where heat still survived. Volunteers passed out blankets and hot drinks. Some shelters filled to capacity within hours, turning people away with apologies they never wanted to speak. And still, the temperature dropped. Inside high-rise apartments overlooking Central Park, wealthy residents stared from their windows, watching as the park disappeared under an ocean of white. Lakes froze solid, trees bowed under ice, statues shivered beneath heavy coats of snow. Joggers vanished, carriages disappeared. Only the wind and the snow remained, carving the land into a silent, frozen desert. In tiny studio apartments, students and workers lit candles, held their hands over weak flames, and shared whatever heat a single flicker could offer. Parents wrapped their children in layers of sweaters, whispering that everything would be fine, even as their own lips turned blue. The city seemed to shrink. Walls felt thinner. Windows felt colder. The world outside was no longer a place people visited. It was a threat they hid from. The first night was only the beginning. The cold settled deeper. The ice thickened. The wind sharpened further. The city, restless and alive on any normal day, became quiet. Streets that once echoed with honking horns and shouting voices were silent enough to hear the snow landing. New York was frozen, not for minutes, not for hours, but for days. And everyone who felt the cold creeping under their doors understood something they had never imagined. Winter had not come to visit. It had come to conquer. By the first morning, New Yorkers woke to a silence they weren't used to. The city that normally hummed, rattled, beeped, and bellowed was strangely, eerily quiet. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence found in small towns or quiet countrysides. It was the silence of something suppressed, something smothered, something held still by the sheer weight of winter. Snow had become the ruler of the night. When dawn arrived, it did not gently brighten the city, it revealed it. Streets, cars, sidewalks, staircases, everything had vanished under a heavy white burial. The snowfall wasn't soft or delicate. It came down like thick cement, piling and crushing everything beneath it. Doorways were blocked. Cars were invisible except for small humps buried beneath ice. Traffic lights were drowned in white hoods of snow, blinking weakly through the frost as if calling for help. Those who dared to step outside felt the shock immediately. The cold slapped against skin hard enough to steal breath. Eyelashes gathered ice crystals. The air was so sharp that even inhaling felt like swallowing needles. Store owners who opened their doors found snow pressed against their entrances like a wall. Some had to push with their shoulders just to slip out, and when they did, they stared at streets that looked nothing like New York. It was like someone had taken the world and dipped it in white concrete. Sidewalks disappeared completely, leaving no clear path for anyone. Cars were trapped in place, packed into snow that came up to their windows. Parking meters vanished, street benches vanished, fire hydrants vanished. Only the tops of street signs poked out, and even they were shaking under the wind. The subway entrances were almost impossible to reach. Staircases leading underground were clogged with ice, the metal rails frosted with a layer so thick it could be scraped off in sheets. People tried to descend carefully, but every step was a risk. One slip could mean a broken bone or worse. The wind, relentless and angry, blew snow sideways in sheets. It did not fall from the sky, it attacked from every direction. You could stand still and still be buried in snow. A few buses started their routes, their engines groaning, tires spinning helplessly against the ice-backed roads. Drivers pressed the gas, wheels turned, but the buses didn't move. Some slid sideways, scraping against curbs and lampposts. Others stalled entirely, engines frozen. Passengers got out and tried walking, but snow reached halfway up their legs. Every step was a struggle. Within an hour, all buses stopped running. Drivers abandoned them where they sat, giant metal beasts frozen mid-route. Taxi drivers fared no better. Yellow cabs normally swarmed like bees through Manhattan, weaving, honking, rushing. But that morning, they barely crawled. Some got stuck almost immediately. Some slid backward down hills, helpless against gravity and ice. Others sat idling near sidewalks, engines rumbling weakly while drivers rubbed their hands over heaters that barely worked. The roads were no longer roads, they were traps, slick, icy, deadly. Subways, the backbone of the city, began to fail too. Deep underground, trains tried to run, but signals froze, switches locked in place. Doors malfunctioned, sliding open only halfway or refusing to close. Commuters stood on platforms surrounded by bodies packed together for warmth. The cold invaded even the tunnels, slithering down staircases and through tile walls. Station floors gleamed with icy layers. People stamped their feet, blew into their hands, hugged themselves, but warmth was impossible to find. Train announcements crackled with confusion and delay. Some trains moved only a few stations before halting. Others never came at all. Above ground, delivery trucks could not make it through. Tires spun, engines died. Grocers who depended on constant supply watched their shelves empty. Fresh fruits and vegetables were gone within hours. Milk, bread, eggs disappeared. People rushed to stores hoping to stock up, only to find bare aisles and dark refrigerators. Cashiers stood near cold registers wearing gloves and hats, staring at lines of disappointed customers. The city that usually fed millions suddenly had nothing left to offer. In office buildings, workers stared out high windows at a city turning white and unrecognizable. Managers told employees to go home early, but going home wasn't easy. Streets were buried, buses weren't running, trains were unreliable, taxis were rare. Some tried to walk long distances, only to realize how dangerous it was. The wind was a force of nature, powerful enough to push adults off balance. Snow blew so thick it erased visibility. People walked 5 feet and disappeared into the white. Others decided to stay inside office buildings, sleeping on chairs or floors because outside was simply too deadly. Emergency alerts flashed across television screens. Meteorologists warned that the temperature was still falling. What the city believed was the storm's peak had only been its opening act. The worst was still coming. Some called friends, family, neighbors, checking on the elderly, asking if anyone needed food, water, blankets. Others sat by windows watching snow slam against glass like waves against rock. It never stopped. It never slowed. It only grew heavier, louder, more violent. As hours passed, the thick white streets turned into icy trenches. Snow drifted so high that it reached the first-floor windows of homes. People opened doors only to find a wall of snow inches from their faces. Shovels broke under the weight. Snowblowers choked and died. Every solution failed. The blizzard was not simply covering the city. It was swallowing it. The power grid strained under the constant demand for heat. Radiators clanged and groaned. Heaters roared. Electric lines sagged beneath layers of ice. Windows vibrated from the force of the wind. Some neighborhoods flickered. Lights dimmed. Then suddenly, entire blocks went dark. People gasped as the power vanished. No lamps, no electric heat, no television, only cold, only dark, only the sound of wind smashing against buildings. In moments like that, silence became fear. Children cried. Parents wrapped them in blankets, whispering comfort they didn't feel. Phone batteries drained quickly as people checked weather alerts, called loved ones, or begged for help. Without electricity, even communication was a luxury that would soon disappear. Outside, the snow continued. It climbed higher, 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 burying parked cars up to their mirrors, swallowing fire escapes, hiding staircases. Mailboxes vanished. Trash cans vanished. The city's landmarks became white lumps in a frozen landscape. The familiar looked alien. Streets that yesterday hosted millions of footsteps now belonged only to winter. Some tried to dig out cars or clear sidewalks, but the effort was pointless. Within minutes, wind erased every struggle, filling every path with snow again. Shovels hit ice instead of ground. Snow was so packed and frozen that even metal tools bent under pressure. People who stayed outside too long felt their skin sting, then burn, then go numb. Frostbite didn't take hours. It took minutes. Fingers stiffened, toes lost feeling, cheeks turned pale and hard. Some collapsed, exhausted and frozen, needing help just to stand. New York's famous hustle was gone. Nobody argued. Nobody rushed. Nobody honked their horn or yelled out a window. The city's heartbeat slowed to a shuddering crawl. The blizzard didn't just stop movement. It stopped identity. New York was no longer fast or fearless or loud. It was vulnerable. Meanwhile, the cold crept inside homes where pipes began freezing solid. The moment water inside them turned to ice, pressure built until the pipes exploded with violent cracks that echoed down hallways. Ceiling tiles caved under bursts of icy water. Kitchen floors flooded, then instantly froze into hard glass. Families scrambled to throw towels, blankets, anything they could to stop the spread of water that turned to ice the moment it touched air. Some slipped and fell on their own floors. Others chipped ice with spoons and knives because tools could not be purchased. Stores were closed, snowed in, powerless, and the storm continued. Daylight barely existed. The sky remained a constant gray, heavy with clouds that looked ready to collapse under the weight of their own snow. People kept glancing out windows hoping to see some sign that the storm was ending, a break in the clouds, a change in the wind, a sliver of light, but the sky remained angry, spitting snow with growing force. On city bridges, the situation was even worse. The Brooklyn Bridge, normally buzzing with cars and pedestrians, stood mostly empty. Snow covered every inch. Steel cables froze solid, coated in thick ice. Gusts of wind roared across the bridge with such violence that any person attempting to cross could be thrown off balance or worse. Police blocked access, waving away walkers who insisted on traveling. The bridge became a ghost, frozen, silent, haunting. Across the skyline, skyscrapers disappeared behind curtains of white. Their lights glowed faintly through the storm, but even those beams seemed tired. Ground level windows collected so much snow they turned into blank screens of white. Streetlights flickered and died. Frost crawled up poles and metal signs, turning them into icy sculptures. In lower Manhattan, near the river, the water itself thickened. Ice spread from the shoreline toward the center of the river, forming plates that cracked and collided with loud snaps. Sailboats and ferries were immobilized, locked in the frozen harbor, their ropes hardened. Their decks turned to slippery ice fields. Waves that should have moved endlessly became stiff and silent. People who braved the storm found themselves walking through a white labyrinth. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Buildings appeared suddenly, looming out of the blur like ghosts. Street corners were unrecognizable. People lost direction, walking in circles without knowing. Some followed the sound of voices or the faint glow of windows just to stay alive. Others crawled on hands and knees to avoid being pushed over by the wind, and yet, even in that misery, the storm was strangely beautiful. The city looked like an enormous snow globe that someone had shaken too hard. Trees along sidewalks bent under white blankets, their branches coated in glittering ice that sparkled under what little light existed. Cars looked like soft, round sculptures. The Statue of Liberty, barely visible through the storm, stood still with her torch covered in frost, her crown powdered with snow. She looked frozen in time, watching silently as the storm changed her city beyond recognition. Hours passed, then more hours, and still the storm did not end. Night came again, quicker than expected. Darkness mixed with the blizzard, making the world outside look like a spinning void of ice. Street lamps created halos of dim yellow light, barely reaching the ground before vanishing in the white chaos. The wind sounded like a wild animal, howling through alleyways, slamming against doors, rattling loose metal, shaking windows in their frames. People tried to sleep, but the cold crept into beds, freezing sheets and pillows. Blankets felt thin, air felt hostile, even dreams were unsettled. Throughout the night, emergency crews worked desperately. Firefighters attacked stubborn flames in freezing temperatures, water hoses turning stiff in their hands, spray turning to ice before hitting the ground. Medics rushed to help people collapsed on sidewalks, wrapping them in blankets and hauling them onto stretchers with wheels that barely rolled on slippery surfaces. Police officers pushed stranded cars to the side of roads, clearing paths that disappeared moments later. They shouted through megaphones that nobody could hear. The storm swallowed their voices. In wealthy neighborhoods, backup generators kicked on, humming like mechanical lifeboats, but even those machines struggled against the cold. Exhaust pipes froze, diesel fuel thickened, engines sputtered, some buildings went dark despite every precaution, and in poorer neighborhoods, where insulation was thin and heating systems old, entire families huddled in one room to share body heat. Some lit candles, some boiled water just to create steam for warmth. Some prayed quietly, staring at frost spreading across windows like cold fingerprints. Phones vibrated with alerts: stay inside, seek warmth, conserve power, do not travel. But for many, staying inside meant freezing in silence, and traveling meant risking death on the streets. It was a choice no one should have to make, yet thousands had no other option. Some people went out searching for medicine. Some searched for family members stranded at work. Some searched for food or water. A few neighborhoods formed volunteer groups, walking door to door, checking on elderly residents afraid to leave their beds. They carried flashlights, shoveled snow, knocked on doors with frozen knuckles, calling out names drowned by the wind. Every story that day was a story of struggle, a nurse walking miles through waste, deep snow to reach her hospital shift. A delivery driver trapped in his truck, wrapping himself in cardboard to stay warm. A mother melting snow with candles for drinking water because her sink was frozen and grocery stores were empty. A homeless man hiding behind a dumpster to block the wind, his breath freezing in the air. And somewhere in the heart of the city, someone stood at their window and realized New York was no longer just cold, it was frozen, still, paralyzed. What was once a roaring machine of life, business, dreams, ambition, noise, speed, was now a silent monument under a blanket of ice. And it was only the first day. Inside the city, things grew even darker. The storm showed no signs of stopping. Snow kept falling, piling, smothering everything beneath it. But while the outside world turned into a frozen wasteland, something far more painful began happening indoors. The cold did not stay outside. It invaded. It crept through walls, crawled under doors, slipped through cracks, and settled in rooms where warmth once lived. New York was supposed to be a fortress of steel and heat. But the storm was tearing that illusion apart, exposing weakness in every brick, every pipe, every building that had stood strong through years of rain, heat, noise, and chaos. Now they trembled against winter's brutal grip. In older apartment buildings, heaters that had rattled faithfully for decades began to fail. Fans spun slower, pipes groaned, radiators hissed out their last breaths of warmth, then fell silent. The moment heat vanished, the temperature inside homes plummeted. People could see their breath floating in front of their faces. Frost formed on the insides of windows, growing thicker by the hour. Curtains became stiff with ice. Wooden floors felt like slabs of frozen stone. Furniture was cold enough to sting when touched. The walls themselves seemed to shiver. Pipes burst across the city, thousands of them snapping under the pressure of ice forming inside them. First came the groan of metal expanding. Then the sharp, violent crack. Water exploded into rooms, shooting like fountains, only to turn solid within seconds. Hallways turned into rivers of ice. Kitchens were covered in sheets of white glass. Bathrooms became frozen caves, every surface slick and solid. Families ran with towels and buckets, but nothing helped. The water hardened faster than hands could move. It was as if the buildings were bleeding ice. Some residents tried to thaw their pipes with hair dryers or space heaters, but those too began to fail. Power flickered everywhere. Entire blocks went dark without warning. Generators hummed where they existed, but only for the lucky few. In most homes, darkness swallowed rooms. Candles flickered with weak, trembling flames. Families gathered around them like ancient tribes, huddled around fire for survival. They sat wrapped in every blanket they owned, winter coats, scarves, hats worn indoors, and still the cold pierced through every layer. Children cried because they did not understand why their warm house now felt like the inside of a freezer. Parents whispered calming words, promising everything would be fine, even as their own voices shook and their faces grew pale. Tea kettles were boiled just to let warm vapor fill the air for a minute or two. People opened ovens and sat in front of them for heat. Some turned on burners hoping to warm their hands. Others boiled pots of water and poured them into tubs, trying to create steam. Nothing lasted. The cold was faster, stronger, crueler. In high-rise apartments, glass windows began to crack under the pressure of ice forming inside the frames. Loud snaps shattered the silence. Some windows broke entirely, letting the storm rush in like a predator. Snow blew across living rooms and kitchens. Curtains flapped wildly. People rushed to tape plastic bags, blankets, cardboard, anything to block the icy wind, but the storm tore their efforts apart. Every defense felt small. Every solution felt temporary. Down in the basements of buildings, water pipes burst and flooded storage rooms. Boxes of belongings froze solid. Elevators jammed from ice forming in their tracks. Residents trapped on high floors had no choice but to take staircases that were dark, frozen, and slippery. Flashlights cut through the darkness as people carefully made their way down, trying not to fall. Every breath lit like smoke. Every railing was cold enough to burn skin through gloves, and while buildings struggled, grocery stores were growing emptier by the minute. Shelves once stocked with produce, bread, meat, and bottled water were barren. Freezers in supermarkets shut down, their contents thawing into useless piles. Fresh food spoiled. Cashiers, wearing hats and gloves, stared at aisles with nothing left to sell. Customers wandered with baskets hoping to find something, anything, but the storm had taken away food as easily as it took away warmth. People rationed whatever they had. A loaf of bread was shared slowly, piece by piece. A single box of cereal became dinner for an entire family. Bottled water was guarded like treasure. The storm didn't just freeze the landscape, it began to starve the city, but hunger wasn't the only threat. The cold damaged bodies in ways many had never imagined. Fingers and toes went numb first, then color faded from skin. Frostbite crept quietly, stealing sensation. People sleeping under layers of blankets woke up with their limbs stiff and painful. Elderly residents suffered most. Their bodies could not fight the cold the way younger ones could. Some tried to move, but their hands shook and their legs felt weak. Water glasses froze on nightstands. Medicines chilled into hard lumps. Breathing felt heavy, as if lungs themselves were turning stiff. Hospitals filled quickly. Ambulances, those that could still drive, brought in victims of frostbite, hypothermia, heart strain, and injury from falls. Emergency rooms were freezing cold. Nurses wore coats inside their own hospitals. Some equipment stopped working. Roman IV tubes froze. Machines flickered and died. Doctors wrapped patients in heated blankets, rubbing their arms and legs to restore blood flow. Children whimpered as their fingers thawed in warm water baths, the pain of returning circulation worse than the numbness before it. Yet medical staff kept working. They moved room to room, floor to floor, treating whoever they could. They heated water. They wiped frost from windows. They prayed that backup generators would hold. For some hospitals they did. For others they failed. When power went out completely, nurses held flashlights between their teeth while working. Doctors performed procedures with hands trembling from cold. The storm didn't care who you were. Rich, poor, young, old. Everyone was a victim. In homeless shelters, space ran out. Hundreds packed into rooms meant for dozens, sitting shoulder to shoulder on cold floors, wrapped in donated blankets, leaning against walls, trying to sleep even as temperature crept lower. Volunteers handed out food, but supplies disappeared fast. Some people were turned away, not because anyone wanted to say no, but because there was literally nowhere left to put them. Outside, those left without shelter curled into doorways, behind dumpsters, under bridges, anywhere the wind was slightly less brutal. Some never woke up again. Firefighters answered calls through the night, but the cold attacked their tools. Hoses froze. Water turned into icicles before reaching flames. Staircases became slick with ice, sending firefighters sliding backward. Trucks skidded and crashed. Still, they worked, hauling people from burning homes, carrying them through snowbanks, driving them to hospitals that struggled to keep their doors open. Police officers checked on stranded drivers, helped people dig through snow, pushed stuck cars, walked mile after mile in boots soaked from melted ice that refroze inside the lining. Their breaths came out in heavy clouds. Their radios kept failing. Their faces went numb, but they continued because stopping meant death, for themselves or someone else. Across the city, heat lamps outside restaurants flickered weakly, then died. Cafes that once served warm coffee and soup became dark, frozen rooms. Chairs froze to floors. Food in refrigerators hardened. Cupboards frosted over. Managers sent staff home, though home no longer meant safety. Many workers tried to walk, stepping into a storm so thick it erased their footsteps behind them. Times Square, normally glowing with advertisements, stood muted and ghostly. Giant digital screens flickered under layers of ice. Neon signs hummed weakly. Street performers who normally crowded the sidewalks had vanished completely. Taxis abandoned by their drivers sat half, buried in snow. Statues of famous figures disappeared under sculpted white mounds. It was a sight New York had never seen, its most famous landmark swallowed by a storm that refused to let the city breathe. Traffic signals blinked red into empty streets, signaling no one. Trash bags left outside froze into rock, hard shapes. Metal lids on garbage cans stuck shut. Rain gutters froze. Roofs sagged under heavy snow and ice. Some collapsed, sending loud crashes through neighborhoods, burying furniture and walls under tons of white weight. People screamed, calling for help. Rescuers fought through snowdrifts waist, high to reach them, and still the cold deepened. The storm showed no mercy. Inside tiny apartments, people sat around candles, staring at flames as if those small orange flickers were the last hope in the world. Silence filled the rooms. No televisions, no radios, no humming heaters, no buzzing refrigerators. Just breathing, shivering, and the occasional cracking sound of ice forming deeper inside building walls. Some prayed, some cried silently so their children would not hear. Some sat still, exhausted, barely able to move. On social media, where connection still worked for those with power, photos circulated of frozen apartments, ice forming on bedroom walls, people sleeping with hats and gloves, glass shattering from the cold. Messages poured in. Is everyone okay? Does anyone have water? My baby is sick. We need blankets. Please send help. The platform became a digital lifeline for those trapped indoors, a way to call out into the world when voices seemed too small to matter. In wealthier neighborhoods, some families had fireplaces. They burned logs, books, cardboard, anything that would produce heat. Beautiful furniture was torn apart for firewood. Old photographs, newspapers, even broken cabinets were fed to flames. Luxury meant nothing. Heat meant everything. In poorer neighborhoods, survival was more desperate. People lit candles and huddled close. They crafted makeshift heaters from metal pots and tea lights. They shared blankets with neighbors. They knocked on doors asking if anyone had medicine or water. Children slept wearing coats and boots. The cold was a predator moving through every block. Time slowed. Seconds stretched into minutes. Hours felt like days. The storm had taken away sound, color, warmth, safety, and familiarity. But it had given one thing in return: fear, not the loud kind, the silent kind. The kind that settles deep in your chest when you realize nature is stronger than everything humans built. The storm transformed New York into something unrecognizable, but humanity has a strange way of shining brightest in darkness. Neighbors who had never spoken to each other shared food and supplies. People opened their doors for anyone who needed warmth. Apartment lobbies became shelters. Strangers sat together, breathing the same cold air, sharing what little they had, reminding each other that they were not alone. Yet nothing stopped the suffering. Babies were born in freezing rooms, wrapped in coats instead of medical blankets. Elderly men and women lay in bed, too cold to move. Pets huddled next to their owners, shivering under blankets. The entire city fought for every heartbeat, and outside, the storm kept howling. No footsteps, no vehicles, no voices, just endless, merciless winter. And New York, a city built to survive anything, found itself learning what survival truly meant. The third dawn of the freeze rose slowly and without promise. There was no warm glow creeping over the horizon, no orange sunrise reflecting off the skyscrapers. The sun remained hidden behind thick layers of icy gray, casting a pale, ghostly light over the silent city. But something felt different. The wind had softened. The brutal howl that ripped through the streets the day before had quieted into a low whisper. Snow still fell, but gently, like dust descending from a broken sky. The cold remained, deep and merciless, but the city was no longer fighting the storm with panic. It was enduring it. It was waiting for something to change. Inside frozen apartments, people woke stiff and sore, their muscles aching from shivering through the night. Some hadn't slept at all. They sat curled beneath blankets, staring at dark ceilings, listening to pipes groan and radiators tick helplessly. Every breath they drew was visible, hanging in the air like ghosts. But as they pushed themselves up and peeled blankets away, many noticed the same thing at the same time: silence. A silence so complete it felt unnatural. New York was never silent. It was a city of engines and voices, footsteps and horns, rumbling trains beneath the ground. Even at 3 in the morning, somewhere, something always moved. But now there was nothing. No cars, no footsteps, no machinery. Only the faint crackle of ice settling against brick and steel. It made people uneasy. It made them wonder what was left. Despite the cold, despite the fear, people needed food, water, medicine, answers. The doors of thousands of apartments opened, and one by one, New Yorkers stepped out into the frozen world again. They moved slowly, like explorers stepping onto the surface of another planet. Snowdrifts reached their knees, in some places their waists. Streets had turned into white canyons, and sidewalks had vanished beneath smooth waves of snow. The city they knew was gone, buried beneath layers of ice. Yet the people walked, wrapped in coats that didn't warm them and scarves that didn't stop the cold. They trudged forward. Some carried shovels, others pulled sleds made of trash can lids or broken cardboard, hoping to bring supplies back home. Children looked around with wide eyes, torn between fear and wonder, seeing their city transformed into a winter wasteland they never imagined. The first stop for many was the nearest store or market, but what they found was not comfort. Shelves were empty, lights were out, doors were frozen shut. Some stores had broken windows where people had forced their way in days earlier, not to steal luxuries, but basics: water, bread, canned food, baby formula, medicine. The snow had drifted inside, swallowing the aisles. Carts were buried, freezers had shut down, and food sat in rock-hard blocks, impossible to cut, impossible to eat. Even the desperation to survive had been frozen in place. Still, people helped one another. Strangers lifted old men from snowbanks. Groups worked together to push aside frozen debris, blocking stairwells and subway entrances. Many shared what little they had: hot drinks that had gone cold but still offered hope, extra gloves, scarves, pieces of fruit that tasted like ice. The freeze had taken almost everything, but it hadn't taken kindness. On the streets, abandoned cars sat in crooked lines like rusted tombstones under the snow. Their bumpers were trapped in thick shells of ice. Their windows were fogged white. Inside them, people had left behind blankets and jackets, desperate to get home when the engines died. Emergency vehicles, too, sat frozen in the roads, sirens buried beneath snow. Fire hydrants were hidden under great white mounds, making the streets nearly unrecognizable. City crews tried to work, but the cold was stronger than machinery. Engines refused to start. Snowplows stalled in the middle of the road. Salt trucks froze in place. The metal on their wheels cracked. Even the strongest machines were reduced to silent monuments of steel. Farther downtown, near the river, something strange happened. As the tide rolled in beneath the ice, plates of frozen water groaned and shifted. Some cracked like thunder, sending deep, echoing booms across the city. Others folded upward, breaking into jagged cliffs of ice. People who lived near the waterfront heard the sound, deep, ancient, like the earth itself was breaking open. But below the surface, the river remained alive. Its hidden currents moved beneath the ice sheets, churning silently like a trapped animal. In some places, the pressure was too strong. The ice split, exploding upward in violent sprays of frozen shards. Bridges rattled, metal supports groaned. The cold had not only frozen the world, it had turned it into something unpredictable. As the day passed, rescue centers grew crowded. Gymnasiums, churches, and libraries. Any building with a working generator became shelters. Families gathered on rows of blankets. Children slept beneath mountains of coats. Nurses checked frostbitten fingers and feet. Volunteers handed out soup in cups that steamed into the air for just seconds before cooling to slush. People from every neighborhood, every background, every age sat together, shivering shoulder to shoulder. Yet even in the suffering, something unspoken formed among them: unity. The freeze had stripped the city of its speed, its noise, its pride. But it had revealed something older, deeper. New Yorkers, who often rushed past one another without a glance, were now sharing stories, helping strangers, holding hands through fear. They were wounded, but they were not broken. Power crews worked desperately to repair lines, but the cold fought back. Ice weighed down wires until they snapped like threads. Transformers froze solid, exploding in flashes of blue light that lit the night sky. Whole neighborhoods stayed dark, but some areas regained power for a few hours at a time, enough for people to charge phones, warm their hands by electric stoves, and call relatives who begged them to stay safe. In those hours of fragile electricity, television screens flickered back on. News anchors spoke carefully, voices steady despite exhaustion. They showed maps of the storm, interviews with rescue workers, warnings about wind chill that could kill exposed skin in minutes. But they also showed something else: groups of neighbors clearing sidewalks together, restaurants giving out free meals until their food ran out, firefighters carrying elderly residents from frozen apartments. It reminded people that they were not alone. Even so, danger was everywhere. In the upper floors of skyscrapers, heat rose and pooled, turning some apartments into warm islands, while the floors below remained bitterly frozen. Ice formed on walls and ceilings, glass windows cracked under pressure, icicles the length of spears hung from balconies, and fire escapes, sharp enough to kill if they fell. In the subway tunnels, where the temperature was just high enough to melt snow dripping from boots and coats, water gathered on the ground, but with no trains running, the water froze solid, turning platforms into glass and stairways into traps. Rats and mice, desperate to survive, climbed higher and higher into buildings, forcing people to barricade doors and vents just to keep them out. Nature was pushing back, reclaiming the underground like a kingdom of its own. The city government made one more attempt to reach everyone who was still trapped or alone. Military trucks, built for snow and ice, arrived slowly from surrounding areas, driving over hardened drifts. Soldiers knocked on doors, wrapped blankets around shivering bodies, carried the weak to warm shelters. They dragged sleds full of supplies, water bottles, canned food, first aid kits, though even the soldiers felt the cold rattle their bones. Night returned too quickly. The sky darkened before anyone was ready. Lamps flicked on, dim through the falling snow. Frost coated every window. The wind, while quieter, still wandered through the city like a ghost. It moved carefully, brushing against buildings, creeping under coats, testing whether New York was ready to stand again, and then, slowly, something began to change. The temperature stopped sinking. It didn't rise, not yet, but it stopped its cruel descent. The storm was losing strength. The sky, once gray and heavy, began to lighten. Snow still drifted down, but softly, like feathers instead of claws. The world felt tired, as if winter itself had grown exhausted from its own fury. On rooftops, the snow settled instead of flying. On streets, the wind stopped carving sharp ridges in the drifts. Inside apartments, people breathed a little easier. Their windows still froze, their breath still hung in the air, but the air no longer stabbed their lungs when they inhaled. Mothers kissed children's foreheads and whispered that tomorrow might be better. Fathers wrapped blankets tighter around their families and dared to hope for the first time in days. But the most powerful moment came just before midnight. Somewhere over the city, high in the frozen sky, a single break in the clouds appeared. It was small at first, barely a tear in the endless gray, but it grew, and from that opening, pale moonlight spilled over New York. It shimmered across the icy streets. It danced on frozen rivers and rooftops, turning the city into a silver kingdom. People stepped onto balconies and rooftops, staring upward with stunned eyes. For days, they had seen only storm clouds pressing down on them like a lid. But now they saw sky, stars, moonlight, proof that the world beyond the storm still existed. Some laughed, some cried, some simply stood silent, letting the moment warm them in a way fire could not. The freeze had taken their routines, their comfort, their certainty. But it had not taken their will, not their spirit, not their identity. In the great silence of the storm, New Yorkers found a truth they often forgot, that survival was not just an instinct, it was a promise they made to one another. They had endured, and though the cold still clung to the city with iron fingers, its strength was fading. The storm had roared for 3 days. Now, at last, it was running out of breath. By the time the fourth morning arrived, the storm had spent itself. It did not leave suddenly, like a monster retreating into the dark. It faded slowly, step by step, as though it were reluctantly releasing its grip on the city. it had tried so hard to conquer. The wind that once screamed between the buildings had calmed into a fragile whisper. The snowflakes still drifted, but lightly, drifting in lazy spirals instead of racing sideways like knives. The sky, once thick and unbroken, revealed streaks of pale silver and hints of blue beneath the clouds. The cold remained, dangerously cold, deep enough to freeze skin and numb fingers, but it was no longer falling. It was holding steady, like a battle that had stopped, even if victory hadn't yet been declared. Inside apartments and shelters, people woke one by one, realizing something felt different. They could hear the faint hum of distant engines, the crackle of radios turning back on, the soft creak of buildings expanding as the air shifted. For 3 days, New York had sounded less like a city and more like a frozen tomb, but now something alive was stirring. Word began to spread, slowly at first, then in excited whispers, then in confident voices. The worst was over. No one trusted it right away. Too many times the cold had fooled them, teasing relief only to return sharper and stronger. But as the morning hours passed and the winds stayed low, hope took root, not the loud, triumphant kind, but the kind that people feel in their bones before they dare say it out loud. The first true sign came from the sky. Clouds thinned, sunlight slipped through, and long shafts of pale gold fell across the frozen city. It wasn't warm, not even close, but it was light, and light felt like life. On the icicles hanging from fire escapes, the sun's reflection shimmered like crystal. Snowbanks glittered, and as people opened doors and stepped outside, they looked upward with a mix of disbelief and overwhelming relief. For the first time in days, they saw a sky that wasn't sealed shut. The world above the storm had finally come back. The streets, however, remained a battlefield of ice. Snowdrifts towered over buried cars. Street signs peeked out like lonely markers in a white desert. Storefronts were hidden beneath sculpted waves of snow, but the wind wasn't tearing the snow apart anymore. It allowed it to rest, and resting snow could be cleared. Plows that had been frozen in place sputtered back to life. Mechanics, bundled in scarves and thick gloves, hammered ice off engines and poured antifreeze into hardened systems. A few machines roared awake, engines coughing out clouds of smoke as they pushed forward. They scraped through ice, metal blades grinding against frozen road. The sound was harsh and ugly, but it was the most beautiful sound the city had heard in days. It was motion. It was progress. Emergency crews, exhausted but determined, began moving again. Firefighters cleared hydrants buried beneath snow, chipping out the ice with axes and crowbars. Ambulances crept forward on hazardous roads, tires spinning until chains caught, inching toward the sick, the weak, and the stranded. Police officers directed what little traffic there was, their breath turning to steam as they shouted instructions through frozen megaphones. And in the middle of this, New Yorkers did what New Yorkers always do. They stepped up. People grabbed shovels, brooms, buckets, anything they could find. Some used pieces of metal they pried from fences. Others used cooking pots to scoop snow. Whole blocks came together, working not for money, not because someone told them to, but because survival wasn't a one-person act. It was a street-wide agreement. Neighbors who had never spoken before shared tools and stories. Elderly residents were escorted from their buildings to warming centers. Apartment owners who still had flickers of heat opened their doors to others. In a city famous for speed, competition, and noise, the freeze had forced everyone to slow down, and in that stillness, humanity grew louder. Even children joined, bundled in oversized coats and mismatched mittens, pushing snow with plastic lids or cardboard sheets. Their laughter returned first, echoing down streets that had been silent for too long. Snowmen appeared on sidewalks, kids carved tunnels through the drifts, and in the middle of devastation there was innocence, small but powerful enough to change the air. Yet beneath the hope lay the truth. The city was wounded, whole blocks had lost power, hospitals ran on backup generators, plumbing failures left buildings without running water, many apartments had become unlivable, coated in frost and broken pipes. Some families moved into warming shelters permanently, carrying bags of clothes, blankets, and memories of the homes they left behind. They weren't just cold, they were displaced, and no one knew how long it would take to repair the damage. Water lines thawed unevenly. In some places, they burst in floods, pouring freezing water into basements and hallways. Firefighters rushed to shut off valves, breaking ice with axes, their boots soaked through. Electricity returned to certain neighborhoods block by block. When lights flickered on for the first time in days, people cheered, some cried, some simply sat on the floor and let the warmth wash over them. Stores reopened slowly. Owners shoveled pathways to their entrances and pushed frozen doors open with their shoulders. Inventory was ruined, scattered across floors or solid with ice. Freezers had become solid blocks. Produce was frozen stiff. Milk and eggs had cracked from the cold, but they opened anyway, not to make money but to feed people. Some gave food away. Others sold whatever was left, taking only coins or handwritten IOU. Food didn't need profit. Food needed to keep people alive. Restaurants cooked huge pots of soup over gas stoves. Volunteers carried steaming bowls through the streets, giving them to anyone who reached out a hand. Fire departments hosted warming tents with coffee that steamed into the cold air. Schools that remained closed opened their cafeterias to families who had nothing left in their kitchens. It was not perfect. It was not enough for everyone, but it was something. And something was better than silence. Public transit came back slowly. Subway tunnels were cleared inch by inch. Crews beat ice from rails with hammers and torches, sparks flying across the dark. Frozen switches were thawed with portable heaters. Train cars moved like ghosts at first, crawling down the rails, testing tracks that looked fragile enough to break. When the first train screeched to a stop at a station, riders clapped and cheered. A few people kissed the rails. The city was breathing again. Above ground, buses returned to limited routes, chains clanking around their tires. Streets that had been dead zones of snow were now moving rivers of slush. The smell of fuel returned. The rumble of engines returned. The heartbeat of the city returned. News crews reported on every sign of progress. Cameras showed bridges being cleared, rescue teams delivering aid, and workers climbing telephone poles to rebuild power lines. But they also showed something else, something unexpected: wildlife returning, birds pecked through the snow, squirrels darted from tree to tree, even stray dogs emerged, shaking snow from their fur, cautiously approaching humans who offered food. The city had frozen everything, but not forever. By evening, the sky cleared completely, and for the first time since the freeze began, the sun set without the weight of storm clouds. It sank behind the buildings, glowing gold and red, reflecting off every icy surface until the whole city shimmered like a jewel. People came outside and watched together, wrapped in coats, holding hands, leaning on one another. Their city looked broken, fragile, scarred, but beautiful. For many, the ordeal became more than a winter disaster. It became a memory, a lesson, a moment in history that would be told for generations. They would remember how the cold turned steel brittle and shattered glass, how silence replaced the noise, how fear replaced confidence, but they would also remember how the city fought back, not with anger or violence, but with unity. Strangers had become friends. Communities had rebuilt themselves. Lives had been saved because people refused to give up. And though the damage was deep, though the scars would take months or years to repair, the people had proven something more powerful than survival. They had proven resilience. The storm had frozen New York for 3 long, merciless days. It had taken warmth, power, safety, and certainty, but it could not take the spirit of the city, not the stubbornness, not the courage, not the refusal to surrender. Night fell again, but this time lights glowed in thousands of windows. Heaters hummed, radios played, children slept under blankets, warm for the first time in days. Snow still covered everything, but it no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a memory fading, inch by inch. Tomorrow, the real rebuilding would begin. Roads would be cleared fully, power restored, food restocked, schools reopened. Engineers would inspect bridges. Crews would fix pipes and rebuild broken homes. Insurance companies would count losses. Historians would document the freeze, and families would tell stories of how they survived, how they helped one another, how the city came together when everything else fell apart. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, New York rested, not in fear, but in victory. When the freeze finally loosened its grip on New York, it did not leave without a mark. The snow didn't melt all at once. It softened, sagged, and slowly receded in uneven patches, like an army retreating step by step, refusing to surrender entirely. The streets remained layered with ice, thick and stubborn, but the city could feel the difference. Cars that had been trapped for days could finally be dug out. Doors that once froze shut now creaked open under human hands. Pipes that exploded in the cold lay exposed, waiting to be repaired. The wounds were everywhere: broken glass, shattered valves, buildings scarred with frost. But now the city could see them, and seeing meant there was a chance to heal. For days, cleanup crews worked without rest. Mountains of snow were pushed into piles taller than trucks. The snowplows, once useless in the height of the storm, clawed their way down avenues, clearing lane after lane. The grinding blades bit through ice, scraping against pavement that hadn't seen sunlight in nearly a week. Sidewalks were shoveled out by the hour. Workers chopped at thick patches of ice with pickaxes, boots slipping as they swung again and again. Steam rose from the warm engines, swirling into the cold morning air. The sounds of construction, scraping metal, and heavy motors replaced the silence that once smothered the city. Noise was back, and it was the sound of recovery. Construction cones lined the streets where pipes had burst and water had frozen into jagged white rivers. Some basements were flooded with ice that needed to be melted with heated air blowers. Water crews dug into frozen pavement with machines and shovels, uncovering broken lines and welding new ones into place. Fire hydrants were steamed loose and tested. For weeks, the city that never slept did not rest for a second, not because it wanted to run fast again, but because it had to survive the aftermath. Stores reopened one by one. Their shelves were bare, but deliveries slowly returned. Trucks rolled in from outside the city, chains clanking around their tires as they brought food, water, fuel, and medicine. Drivers who had waited out the storm on the highways now drove into town with supplies, greeted by exhausted store owners and families who lined up for hours just to buy essentials. Even then, people didn't push or fight. They passed items down the line, shared bags of bread, divided packs of water. After surviving the freeze, small acts of generosity felt like wealth. In the days that followed, New Yorkers began talking again, not just to their friends and families, but to everyone. On sidewalks, in coffee shops, at bus stops, people traded stories of how they survived. Some had slept together in hallways, huddled near a single candle for warmth. Others kept radios alive with hand crank chargers when electricity failed. Some had broken into abandoned taxis just to escape the wind for a few minutes. Everyone knew someone who had lost power, lost heat, or nearly lost hope. These stories weren't told with drama or pride. They were told quietly, honestly, like confessions shared among survivors of the same incredible trial. Schools reopened with shortened hours. Children returned wearing extra layers, walking in boots crusted with ice. Teachers greeted them with tired smiles and warm cocoa. Classrooms filled with laughter again, not the loud, wild kind, but the softer, grateful kind that comes from children who understand, even if they don't have the words for it, that something extraordinary has happened. They drew pictures of frozen rivers, of giant icicles, of wrapped-up stick figures standing in snow that reached their chests. They talked about seeing their parents cry, or how they slept in the same bed as their whole family, or how they saw the stars after the clouds finally broke. In their innocence, the children turned trauma into memory, and memory into story. For adults, the emotional shift was slower. The freeze had changed them in ways they didn't fully understand yet. Some sat alone in repaired homes, staring at walls that once sparkled with frost. Some walked through rooms where pipes had burst, where floors had buckled, where photographs were ruined by frozen water. The storm had not stolen only comfort. It had taken homes, savings, businesses. Insurance offices were crowded for weeks, papers piled high on desks as agents tried to process claims, assess damage, and offer help. Not every home could be repaired quickly. Some were too old, too damaged. Families moved into temporary housing. Neighbors donated furniture, heaters, blankets, clothes. Some cried in the quiet of night, when children slept and the house was still too cold to feel safe. Yet amid hardship came something unexpected. People began noticing things they had never seen before. The woman they always passed in the hallway, who never waved, was the same woman who lent them food when their pantry was empty. The man they once complained about for playing loud music was the same man who checked on elderly neighbors during the freeze. Communities that once felt distant became close. Strangers became allies. People who lived years on the same street without speaking now shared meals, stories, and work. The freeze had burnt away distance, leaving behind something raw and human. The city government released reports, charts, maps. The freeze had broken water mains, collapsed roofs, caused millions in property damage, and filled hospitals for weeks. Scientists called it one of the most severe freezes in modern history. Historians compared it to events from centuries earlier. Meteorologists argued about how a storm of such scale had formed. Politicians made speeches about infrastructure and preparation. But for the people who lived through it, none of that captured the truth. The facts were cold. The reality had been colder. In the months that followed, art began to appear across the city. Murals painted on walls, photographs displayed in galleries, poems printed in newspapers. Artists captured the silence, the eerie beauty of frozen streets, the glow of moonlight on ice, the dark windows of powerless skyscrapers. Sculptors carved ice into memorials before it melted away. Musicians wrote songs about the night. The whole city slept beneath blankets because the electricity died. Writers published essays and books about how the storm tested the strength, not of buildings, but of human hearts. Some businesses didn't survive. Small family-owned shops that had already been struggling shut their doors for good. Neighbors placed flowers in front of locked gates, thanking them for years of work. Others rebuilt from nothing. Volunteers swept out broken glass, hammered boards into windows, and helped paint new signs. The freeze had taken, but it had also unified. People refused to let their city crumble. Months later, when the first warm day of spring arrived, it felt unreal. Snow melted into rushing water, washing through the streets like a cleansing tide. Grass returned to Central Park. Trees stretched their branches, leaves budding in slow green whispers. New Yorkers sat on benches again, face turned toward the sun, as if trying to absorb every drop of warmth the world had owed them. Dogs returned to the parks, chasing balls and shaking wet fur onto laughing owners. Cyclists rode through streets cleared at last of ice-piled curbs, and slowly the city looked like itself again, but something inside the people had changed permanently. They walked slower, they noticed others more. They spoke to neighbors they once ignored. They remembered how fragile life could be, how fast normal could disappear, how strong human beings became when there was no other choice. On the anniversary of the freeze, a ceremony was held in Central Park. Thousands gathered, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. Candles flickered in paper cups, scarves fluttered in the wind. The mayor gave a speech, but the words people remembered didn't come from microphones. They came from the crowd, from survivors telling each other, "We made it," from families saying, "I'm glad you're here," from strangers exchanging nods that carried the weight of history. The city did not forget. It built new weather systems, reinforced pipes, created emergency response plans. Engineers designed heating shelters that could activate instantly in future storms. Utility companies upgraded power lines and backup grids. Schools taught children about the freeze, about science, yes, but also about compassion, because the memory was not just about cold, it was about connection. The story spread far beyond New York. Other cities learned from it. Other countries studied it. Articles appeared in magazines around the world about how one of the largest cities on Earth nearly froze, and how ordinary people saved it, not with machines, not with wealth, but with each other. Years later, people still remembered where they were when the freeze began. They remembered the fear in the first silent night, the ice on their windows, the meals shared with strangers, the moonlight on the frozen river. They remembered how quiet the city had been when everything stopped, and how loud the city became when hope returned. Some would say the storm was the worst thing that ever happened to New York, but others would say it was the moment the city discovered why